Our next panel is Opportunities and Obstacles for Renewable Gas in the California Legislature. The panel will be moderated by Julia Levin, who is the Executive Director of the Bioenergy Association of California. Julia until recently, served as the Deputy Secretary for Climate Change and Energy at the California Resources Agency. In that position, she chaired the Governor's Interagency Bioenergy Working Group and led development of California's 2012 Bioenergy Action Plan. Julia has also served as a commissioner on the California Energy Commission, where she was the presiding commissioner on renewable energy and associate commissioner on energy efficiency. She presided over the adoption of the RPS eligibility rules, power plant siting cases, and other issues. Previously, she was the Global Warming Director at the National Audubon Society, where she coordinated its policy advocacy and public education on global warming and energy issues. Please join me in welcoming Julia Levin.
Hi, everybody. So you can see that we're missing one speaker, Kip Lipper. Unfortunately, it is crazy time in the legislature this week, and so he sends his regrets, but he's not going to be able to join us. Having said that, we still have two incredibly smart, talented, progressive, helpful, thoughtful women. Wait a minute. Two powerful women leaders together. Are you ready? Guys, it's okay. You don't have to sweat. It's not really going to happen. In this room, though, we do have two incredibly knowledgeable and effective, important allies to renewable gas. Tina Andolina, who works for Senator Ben Allen, and Erin Baum, who works for Assemblyman Doss Williams. So please welcome our speakers. I'm going to give longer introductions to them in just a moment. Before I hand it over to Tina and to Erin, I just wanted to provide a couple of high-level comments. I thought Kip was going to provide, but I'll do my best to stand in his place, or really not stand in his place, but give my own perspective. I would say the last 3 or 4 years have been a real up and down in terms of the legislative approach or the legislative view of bioenergy. We've had some big victories, we've had some big setbacks, and I think we've got a long way to go still, and we have some real challenges in front of us. On the positive side, in 2012, thanks to many people in this room, we passed two really important bills, one by Assemblyman Gatto that he spoke about earlier this morning, to help finally get biogas into California pipelines. Unfortunately, in the 4 years since the bill was passed, we've yet to build a single new pipeline biogas project. Hopefully, with the bills that Assemblyman Williams and Senator Allen are authoring, we will finally be able to get biogas into the pipeline. Also in 2012, we passed a Renewable Biogas to Electricity bill, SB 1122 by Senator Rubio, not to be confused with the Senator Rubio from Florida, our own California Senator Rubio. And that requires 250 megawatts of small-scale bioenergy projects, so distributed generation projects. Common theme, in the 4 years since we passed that bill, we haven't seen a single new project that is eligible and participating in the SB 1122, or as it's now known, Biomat program. So clearly we need some changes there as well. On a more positive note, in 2014, we passed a bill by Senator Lara that requires the Air Board to adopt a policy or a strategy to reduce short-lived climate pollutants. And I think going forward, that combined with hopefully the passage of SB 32 this year really will become huge drivers for bioenergy. In fact, the draft strategy to reduce short-lived climate pollutants that the Air Board released a few months ago says very strongly that we need a statewide policy to promote biogas and provide long-term market certainty. It goes on to say we've got to remove barriers to pipeline injection. We've got to make it easier, faster, cheaper to get biogas into the pipeline and onto the transmission lines, because, as several speakers have noted, the biggest sources of short-lived climate pollutants are all related to organic waste. Number one short-lived climate pollutant is black carbon from wildfire. We have a tree mortality crisis in California. And just to put some numbers to it, a year ago we had 29 million dead trees in the Sierra Nevadas. As of last week, in 6 counties alone in the Southern Sierra, we're up to 66 million dead trees. 66 million dead trees. It is the majority of the trees in 6 counties and rapidly approaching the majority of trees in another 6 to 8 counties. We've already lost lives this year to wildfire. We've lost homes. We have entire communities that are threatened. We've got to get some of those trees out, and we need to do something beneficial with them, not ship them to China to make cement. We can use them right here for energy production. In addition to black carbon from wildfire, the second largest source of short-lived climate pollutants is methane from dairies. And we have got to capture that methane and do something beneficial with it, which is energy production. So I think, and then the third obvious source is landfills and diverting organic waste away from landfills and using that organic waste to produce energy and compost and other beneficial products. So I think that when the short-lived climate pollutant strategy is finalized, that is going to become a very large driver for bioenergy. That still isn't enough, though. We've got to get SB 32 passed this year. Hopefully the legislature will pass SB 1383, which will put legislative targets into the short-lived climate pollutant strategy that the state has to meet, and that these will be the real drivers for bioenergy going forward and hopefully accelerate the development of this market. We've got a long way to go, though. Even with these big sort of high-level policies that hopefully will help drive the market, we've got a lot of challenges. As I said, we're not making progress on pipeline or electricity projects despite legislation that passed 4 years ago. So this year, given all of these drivers, the need to reduce methane and black carbon and the need to divert organic waste away from landfills, there was a slew of biomethane and biogas related legislation introduced, much of it from the authors whose staff are here today. So I am going to hand it over to Tina and to Erin to talk about some of the bills that their offices are authoring and where they see those bills and other policies going forward over the next couple of years. So let me start with Tina Andolina, who is the Senior Policy Consultant for State Senator Ben Allen. Tina, before working for Senator Allen, Tina was the Director of Legislation and Regulation at the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. She's also been a legislative consultant for Senator Wolk and the Legislative Director of the Planning and Conservation League. And actually, before that, she worked with Todd Campbell and me and a number of us, Tim Carmichael, if you're here, at the Coalition for Clean Air. So Tina has a long history on these issues and has already been really, really helpful in Senator Allen's office, and we're looking forward to her being here for a long time. So Tina Andolina.
Thank you very much. Is this turned on? Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I remember being here last year staffing Senator Allen when he was your morning keynote speaker, talking about what we needed to do in the California legislature to increase the market incentives, increase the market diversity, increase the amount of renewable gas that we see here in California. This was a new issue for Senator Allen, but not one that doesn't make complete sense. Just like it took a combination of policies, incentives, funding to get California's electricity sector to increase its renewable portfolio. The same thing is absolutely true for renewable gas in the state. As Julia mentioned, we have great laws on the books that seek to increase the use of renewable gas, both in the electricity sector and the transportation sector. We also have the low carbon fuel standard, which one would think would absolutely promote renewable gas. Although even with these laws on the books, we haven't seen the kind of market certainty and the market growth that we had hoped for. So because of that, last year, Senator Allen introduced SB 687. That bill sought to set up a renewable standard for biogas and biomethane the same way we did for renewable electricity. And when we saw how we saw the renewable portfolio standard work for electricity, it's clear that that was the kind of policy we needed. We introduced that legislation with broad support from the industry and from a lot of the stakeholders. And interestingly, we ran into a significant amount of opposition from both the right and the left. We had opposition from deep within the environmental community, the entire spectrum of the environmental community, and we had opposition from the agricultural community, folks that you would think would absolutely support that kind of policy and would directly benefit from it. That bill did not even make it out of the Senate. We got through 2 policy committees, but died before we even got to the Senate floor. So one of the lessons that we learned through that discussion and debate was, okay, maybe the state's not ready for an RGS, a renewable gas standard, quite yet. And we know it took a couple of years to pass the RPS. So we thought, okay, you know what, let's take a step back. Let's talk to our stakeholders and figure out what folks could be comfortable with to move renewable gas forward. And then we introduced this year SB 1043. That bill was a much simpler, scaled back version of SB 687. That bill simply said, hey, Air Resources Board, develop a standard, develop policies that will increase the use of renewable gas in California. That's it. Increase the use of renewable gas in California. That's what we introduced. And of course, over the course of several months, we put on belts and suspenders and talking with the environmental community, what they needed to see and other stakeholders. Interestingly, that bill didn't make it any further. That bill had less opposition, far more support, seemed to be far more palatable to many of the stakeholders that we encountered, but we still couldn't get it even to the Senate floor. And that begs the question, why? Why is it that the legislature has recognized that we want to increase the use of renewable gas, we want to get it into the pipeline, we want to get it into the transportation sector, but we can't do something as simple as ask the Air Board to establish a statewide policy to promote the use of renewable gas? And I have a few thoughts on why that might be, and I've given it thought after being invited to this panel, given it even more thought. The opposition that we encountered to both of these bills, coming both from the left and the right, is significant, but it is emblematic of, I think, a lack of an overall shared vision for how to accomplish this, right? We have folks that we were working with in our coalition that knew the buzzsaw we ran into with the RGS, and understood the concerns from the environmental community, even if they weren't shared by everyone, or understood the concerns by the agricultural committee, even if it didn't seem like they were entirely legitimate, but actually understood those concerns, and others from within industry who didn't understand those concerns and thought other paths could be taken. So there wasn't this sort of coming together in an industry to say, look, here's the path that we need to follow. Even something as simple as, let's put this in the hands of the Air Board to make something happen. We didn't even have an entire coalition supporting that. There was dissension from within industry. We had environmental support from that bill, which was exciting and fairly remarkable, because it demonstrated, I think, a movement from within the environmental community from being concerned and scared of renewable gas, being concerned that it's too close to just natural gas, that there are health implications, there are environmental drawbacks, the GHG benefits aren't enough, to understanding that this is going to be a part of an overall solution. So we saw that movement in between the two bills, and that's absolute progress. I think we also saw movement from within the agricultural community, which is very exciting. The notion that it might take policy requirements and mandates from the state to deal with the greenhouse gas emissions that we're seeing from dairy digesters, or from dairy operations, for example. So we saw movement there. So I think while pursuing these policies, we've seen fits and starts. I think we've laid some groundwork. I think that some paths have been open to us. But I would say the two biggest obstacles would be the lack of an overall community vision here that pulls in the other stakeholders that stand to benefit, or their organizations, right? Their mission stands to benefit from this type of technology, coming together with a shared vision, and lack of knowledge and understanding in the legislature. This is not one of those issues that's common sense for folks. It took me a whole year to understand some of the nuances around the gas sector and interconnection and the issues and the difference between the various technologies. I'm not sure I still understand them completely. But you can imagine the lack of education in the legislature on such a complex issue leads to fear and distrust and uncertainty. And when you have those elements, it's very difficult to pass landmark policy. So I think those are some of the obstacles that we face. And I'm going to say, just as an aside, one other layer in all of this was the Aliso Canyon gas leak that began last year, that was just plugged this year at Porter Ranch, and the methane emissions that we experienced with that. I think it absolutely highlighted the devastating effects of methane emissions, and folks, especially after Paris, folks in the legislature are taking that more seriously, so I think that's an opportunity. But then there was also fear of, what's the difference between this type of methane and the renewable gas policies that are being promoted. So there was some uncertainty there. And Senator Allen introduced SB 888, seeking to use the penalties that the PUC would assess on the gas company for Porter Ranch and use that to actually mitigate pound for pound the methane emissions. That bill's still moving, and we expect that to be on the Assembly floor soon, and there's no opposition to that measure, which is really exciting. But that'll be a very significant way to sort of get at these methane emissions and maybe help bolster the notion of renewable gas, since obviously promoting renewable gas would be a key way to mitigate some of the methane emissions that we experienced at Porter Ranch. Maybe this funding is a way that we can bolster that market and offer some certainty. So we're exploring that as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Tina. I have to say, it has been an incredible pleasure to work with Tina. I mean, you all know these are complicated issues. There are a lot of questions about the technology, the feedstocks, the different technologies, how the different pros and cons, and even the different solutions, and trying not to, what's the expression? Where the cure is worse than the illness, sort of. We had a lot of jumping through different hoops, trying to solve one problem and creating another one, and Tina has been extraordinary to work with. She's not alone, though. Erin has jumped into the same fire in the last several months, well, actually earlier this year. Next I would like to introduce Erin Baum from Assemblyman Das Williams' office. Erin has served in the State Assembly for more than 10 years, advising a variety of members on energy and environmental issues. She's currently the legislative director for Assemblyman Williams, where she is carrying so many issues. I don't know how she keeps her head above water. It's pretty extraordinary. Unfortunately, he is termed out. This is his last year, and he's lost some staff. And so I think Erin is not only the legislative director, I think she's the legislative expert and the legislative assistant and the legislative analyst and everything else in Assemblyman Williams' office at this point. Prior to serving as a legislative assistant, Erin has also been chosen as the Jesse Unruh Assembly Fellow by the Capital Fellowship Program, and she has also worked for Assemblyman Ira Ruskin, so a tradition of working for great legislators. So please welcome Erin Baum from Assemblyman Williams' office.
Thank you for having me here today, and thank you, Julia. I work for Assemblyman Das Williams, as Julia mentioned. He's the current chair of the Natural Resources Committee, and he's a very enthusiastic and environmentally minded member, and it's been a real pleasure to work for him during his tenure at the Assembly. In the context of having a discussion about how to increase the use of biomethane, I don't think we can undervalue the experience. I think it's dangerous to undervalue the experience that we had with adopting the RPS. And I want to underscore some of Tina's points about our renewable portfolio standard. It is our centerpiece in California's effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with electricity consumption in California. And at the time at which we were discussing adopting an RPS in the first place, people argued that it was going to lead to price instability, that renewable energy would always be more expensive when compared with its fossil fuel counterparts. And they always assumed that natural gas prices were stable and therefore always the cheaper alternative. But you look at where we are now. We're well on our way to achieving 33% renewables by 2020. Renewable energy costs continue to drop to the point where they're competitive with fossil fuel alternatives. And renewable energy also can provide long-term price stability because we have statutory targets. In other words, we have a very successful model to look toward when we're looking at decarbonizing the gas sector. So where are we with biomethane? The law requires California to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 standards by 2020, and ARB was given broad authority to achieve those goals. In their most recent update to the scoping plan, they had a number of sector-specific recommendations, not the least of which was promoting the development of bioenergy. The governor has proposed expending greenhouse gas reduction dollars on some programs that achieve those ends, including the NOx engine incentives, which would fund those trucks with low NOx certified engines that use bioenergy. The law also requires that the state procure half of its electricity from renewable sources. And over the last 10 years, our RPS statutes have evolved to include bioenergy, which includes landfill and digester gas. The law also explicitly requires California to identify barriers to biomethane. In the CEC's 2012 Bioenergy Action Plan, they specifically recommended increasing research and development for bioenergy technologies, developing information about the availability for bioenergy development, streamlining permitting processes for bioenergy facilities, and facilitating access to transmission, pipelines, and other distribution networks. The legislature, as Julia mentioned earlier, introduced no less than 10 bills on the subject this year, from feed-in tariffs to examining the quality standards for injection into common carrier pipelines. So I think it's safe to say policymakers are paying attention. This is definitely a hot topic this year. Most recently on biomethane, my boss has introduced a few bills, two of which are, well, one of which is still alive, the other one we're still working on. And those relate to the cost of interconnection and the quality standards for injection. And in my research this year, in talking with not only members of the industry, but also staff members for the relevant environmental regulators, it seemed like they settled on two barriers to biomethane production, and that was the cost to interconnect to common carrier pipelines and the standards for the quality of biomethane. On cost, or my boss's AB 2313, we were told sort of universally that the cost to interconnect makes these projects infeasible, and that's also because biomethane producers are responsible for all the other regulatory costs associated with the production of biomethane. We were constrained by the PUC's recent decision on assigning costs related to biomethane, and that's because they were in turn constrained by their interpretation of existing statute, which was meant to encourage biomethane, but other existing statutes which have sort of a contradictory goal and do not encourage the production of alternative gas sources. When it comes to solving the issue of costs, the legislature is inevitably faced with the question of where does the money come from? We have a few favorite sources that we've beaten to death over the last few years. And if you don't have a good answer to that question, you're inevitably hung up in the legislative process. I don't know how many of you are familiar with our appropriations suspense files, but those can frequently act as a black hole when you're trying to move progressive environmental legislation. So we took a pretty narrow approach to solving this issue. We altered the parameters of an existing financial incentive adopted by the PUC. We increased the per project cap that a project could apply for a rebate from the PUC when they're recovering costs for interconnection. We did additionally try to authorize utilities to recover in rates the cost of interconnection, but we were met with some pretty strenuous objections from the policy committee, even though we did have support from both SoCalGas and PG&E. And while we did have to strip that language from the bill, we did secure an agreement moving forward to allow the PUC to consider rate basing that infrastructure once the existing incentives are dried up. So there's hope for more money in the future. And unfortunately, that bill currently enjoys bipartisan support and is moving forward. On standards, or my boss's AB 2206, the PUC recently adopted 17 constituents of concern, 12 of which were based off of ARBs and the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments, recommendations for protecting human health. There were 5 additional standards that protect end-use equipment, and I would say that most biogas producers supported the public health standards, but they objected to 2 of the end-use equipment standards, and those were specifically the minimum heating values and the siloxane requirements. The main objections were that the PUC didn't consider the source of the biogas, and there are some sources that necessarily have lower levels of siloxanes than others. But I think the most important point of this narrative is that all legislators, no matter how senior or experienced, are discouraged from writing technical standards into statute, and for good reason. It is also very hard to engage another office or another staff person or a member on technical standards. So with the help of Julia, we actually came up with a pretty ingenious solution, which is drafted a study bill. And study bills are notorious for getting held in each house's fiscal committees. But instead, we kicked this study to a creature of the legislature, which is the California Council on Science and Technology, who recently completed a study per statutory requirements on hydraulic fracturing. So not only are they gaining some authority within the legislature, but we had precedent to point to. Fortunately, that language now exists in budget trailer bills, which will likely be adopted soon. So my hope is that issue will have resolved itself shortly. To be clear, I don't think that either of these 2 issues are barriers with a big B. These are barriers with a small b. They are significant, but I don't think addressing these individually is going to spur statewide production or development of biomethane. And that is why I think we need statewide policy, which, as I mentioned earlier, we have a very good model to look towards, and that's all I have to say for now.
One day we'll get it.
Yeah, maybe.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. You can see that both Erin and Tina have become real experts in this pretty complicated subject matter. So before opening it up to the audience, I wanted to ask a couple of follow-up questions, just use the moderator's prerogative, and especially since we don't have a third speaker. I was interested in an earlier panel with George Minter and Malik. I'm not going to bastardize your last name, I'm sorry, who both made a comment, I think, similar to what Erin and Tina just said, is the need to follow the successful model in the electricity sector. And it was interesting and somewhat encouraging to hear that from our 2 largest gas utilities in the state. But given the strong headwinds that we've faced really now on 3 bills, what do you 2 see as the most important things we all can do to lay the groundwork for that, hopefully in one of the next few years? And what do you think are the biggest obstacles? I mean, the whole theme today is supposed to be the obstacles and the opportunities, or barriers and opportunities, something like that. So what do you see as the biggest barriers in the legislature to us getting the big B barriers addressed? And maybe Erin, we'll start with you this time.
I think in part Tina actually hit on it earlier, and that's familiarity among the members. I think that as you have members that have shorter terms leaving office, and you have members who are going to be here for 12 years or longer sticking around, that problem probably might start to resolve itself. But I think that familiarity with the issue among the members and legislative buy-in to the alternatives and belief in the alternatives is the primary barrier right now. I think most people are not familiar with what is a pretty technical issue.
And I would say from a practical standpoint, as staff who needs to help build the coalition to push these policies, it'd be super helpful to have the gas utilities on the same side. You know, all of us going forward and saying, these are the types of policies that we need to see in the legislature. I know it's not easy, and I'm not sure everyone has the same answer yet, and maybe we need to take just a little bit of time to get folks around a table and come together on what that answer should be. Is it a renewable gas standard? Is that the right approach? And if so, what does that standard look like? And who are the folks, and I think of the environmental community because they were some of the hardest ones that we had to deal with this past year. what are the concerns that we need to address? What is the education that needs to happen so folks feel comfortable with these technologies? But I would say I'm gonna go back to that shared vision. Every element in this industry, from the technology developers to the gas sellers, at every level, we need to come together and say, this is the policy that we need. You know, those guys that have the waste that can actually benefit from these policies need to come forward and offer some solutions.
And just to add on to that, I think that additional buy-in from our executive agencies, the people responsible for implementing this, they hold a lot of authority with legislative members. I think having buy-in from that sector as well is really important.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions because I can imagine there are a few since we're at kind of a key juncture in the legislative session. Paul, go ahead, Paul. Rudd.
Really appreciate the breakdown of what broke down. I couldn't help but think the mention was made of the RPS, setting the RPS standard. And now I'm speaking as a board member of the Bioenergy Association of California because this was a priority bill, 1043, for our association. And of course, the second year we were unable to bring it home. But what was the process that created the RPS? Because the core issue for the Bioenergy Association from the get-go is to achieve parity with other renewable energy sources. And they got a jump start. They got benefits that we don't have at this juncture. It's not that we need them forever, but we need a bridge. And so we thought that having a standard, some number or some way to increase the use of and secure it for the long term, because we see with the LCFS the exposure we have. So could you tell us, well, Julia, you were part of the RPS.
A major part of it.
How did that come together? And are there any lessons specifically for us next time around?
So for those of you who don't know, I actually led the campaign to pass the first RPS. And it took us 2 years, in 2001 and 2002. It was a very different situation. California was already at 10% renewable electricity, but had stalled at 10% for more than a decade. And in 2001, those of you that lived in California know, we experienced an artificial but very, very painful energy crisis. And I say artificial because it was entirely the result of market manipulation from out-of-state natural gas traders. What that did is not only make the legislature realize that we were way too dependent on out-of-state natural gas, but that allowed the market prices to fluctuate very, very dramatically. And there was a lot of education involved in that crisis that it sort of did the job for us, that we were shipping billions of dollars and thousands of jobs out of state, and we were incredibly vulnerable to people and companies that didn't care what happened in California, didn't care if our utilities went bankrupt and ratepayers went into huge debt as a result. So that all helped us a lot to lay the groundwork. Sadly, September 11th happened right at the end of session in 2001. We thought we were going to pass the bill that year. We weren't able to. That added a whole nother element, which was the whole concern about energy security and energy independence. It really shined a spotlight on that. But I think the other thing that was different in that situation, I was working in the environmental community at the time, there were 3 legs on the stool that supported the RPS. It was the environmental community, the renewables industry, and labor. And I don't know if there's anyone in this room from labor now, but that is a very important constituency in Sacramento that we need to engage on these issues. There's one study by UC Berkeley that says that biogas can provide 2 to 6 times as many jobs as fossil fuel gas. And we do still import most of our natural gas from out of state. So there's a real job producing benefit of renewable gas that we develop in state. So we need to get labor engaged. And I think Bill McGavern was here from the Coalition for Clean Air. Are you still here, Bill? Hi, Bill. Bill has been, one of very few environmental community voices that has actively helped us and supported renewable gas and done right. I mean, we want to be careful how we do it, but we don't have the Union of Concerned Scientists, my former employer who, led the fight for the RPS. We don't have NRDC, although the CEO spoke here last year. We weren't able to get them to support any of the policies we're working on to promote renewable gas. So I think much as we need the education in the legislature, we need it just as much in the environmental community. And Tina and Erin, you should add to that.
I want to just reiterate, we got so many questions from within the environmental community about the climate impacts of renewable gas. And interestingly, one of the harder nuts that we tried to crack this year around that question was the forest biomass component. There were folks that were significantly concerned, not with the combustion of trees, because that's not what we're talking about here, but just the notion of removing trees and what could happen if you've got an RGS on the books that's saying, hey, we need to bring in a certain level of renewable gas. Is that going to cause mass deforestation? These were the questions that we were facing, and they were difficult. And I think that was one of the tougher issues, one of those fine lines that we had to walk. I think we nearly got there, but it was by the time we got there, it was too late for 1043. And I think part of the reason it was too late for 1043, and I have to tell you, Erin alluded to the appropriations suspense calendar, the suspense file being a black hole. It really is. I mean, the term suspense is no joke. You have no idea if your bill is going to live or die when it is on the suspense file, and any bill that costs money goes there. So when the day comes where they determine bills, which bills are going to live and which bills are going to die, oftentimes it's a bloodbath. And I would have bet money that this bill was going to move. I was certain it was going to move. And you're never certain, but as certain as one could be, I was certain that this was going to be okay. And I think going back to the confusion about the technologies, the confusion about the environmental impacts of renewable gas, we got late opposition from the Hydrogen Business Council because of amendments that we had taken earlier to deal with some opposition. And because there isn't a whole lot known about biogas and renewable gas and synthetic gas and the various technologies, any kind of uncertainty that is injected into the process, particularly at a vulnerable point like the appropriation suspense calendar, is super problematic. And we scrambled to take amendments and to draft amendments that would deal with the issue. But it was too late by that point. I think enough damage had been done, and I can't say that that's the reason that the bill was held on suspense. I don't know that that's the reason that the bill died. We've hypothesized many other potential causes of death, but I think that was a contributing factor.
Norma?
I guess just getting back to the very specific barrier of interconnection costs, two ways forward that wouldn't cost ratepayers money and wouldn't cost the taxpayers money, but could do a lot to improve things. One would be to impose what I think would protect ratepayers, which is third-party oversight over the interconnection costs. There's quite a few projects in this room for which the interconnection study appears to suggest costs that are way out of line with conventional gas interconnections. The second one is to get the public benefit exemption so that the CIAC does not pertain to these projects. And there's both a perfectly legal IRS route to get there, or there's a piece of paper that could be in the form of an executive order
Norma,
or something from CPUC.
Can I just interrupt? Because I don't think most people in the room know what I can't even remember the acronym you used. The
Contribution
tax.
in aid of construction.
Okay.
So
you might want to explain what that is.
So the
Sorry.
tax, if the time and materials to construct the interconnection is $5 million and there's a 22% or 35%, the percent tax changes. then you have to pay that above and beyond, so that none of that comes out of the pocket right now of the utility. So while we're trying to get these done, we want fair and reasonable costs. We don't, so anyway, I should phrase this in terms of a question. From the standpoint of these two very specific actions, do you view those as requiring legislation, or would you see that this is something that the CPUC could decide within itself and impose from a regulatory standpoint?
Whether or not they'd require legislation, I'm actually not sure. But I think that at least one of the issues that you raised was addressed in the PUC's decision when they assigned the appropriate costs to producers. They, in our conversations, specifically with Commissioner Peterman, made it clear that they interpreted existing statute that requires non-discriminatory access to pipelines as constraining what costs they'd assign and where. And
I apologize for interrupting, but no, I'm not questioning who pays the cost of the physical interconnection. I'm not questioning that. But the tax that's above and beyond that, the way that utilities can be exempt from that tax is a ruling from the federal IRS.
I see.
That it has public benefit. So you still have to pay the $5 million, but you don't have to pay the 22 or the 34% on top of that $5 million.
And if it's a federal tax, I don't know to what degree we can have an impact on that with legislation, and I'm not sure if the PUC would even have authority to make that change
I
either.
think the question is, could the legislature or the PUC determine that injecting biogas into the pipeline is a public benefit just per se? And then I don't understand exactly the mechanics, but then the utilities can waive that they don't have to pay the tax.
I think the short answer is I actually don't know the answer to your question.
Not to get too wonkish on it, but biogas and biomethane offers PhD ideas to a sixth grade world. We've got to get it dumbed down. The CAC is just a perfect example. It's a tax accounting treatment. The different utilities can elect to do it differently, and I have experienced it firsthand. I don't know what it has to take. It is an IRS ruling. It's the company, how they elect to treat that tax. It all gets involved with adjusting the profit and what gets allocated between shareholder and ratepayer money and those complicated taxing issues. So it is up to the companies. That can be harmonized in the state. It depends on which utilities you're working with and which tax treatment they elect. So again, this is why biomethane, the interconnection process needs to be streamlined. And if those CAC portions are reimbursable or part of the adjustment in the legislation, it's fine. So if you're in a CAC elected utility that wants to pay the tax, you can adjust it that way. But I'll close with, we need sixth grade arguments to communicate to the external groups and to the other constituents. End of the story. We go out there and we get really wonkish, and this is what stops us cold. You can't build a coalition with really complicated PhD arguments. We've got to dumb it down and connect it to somebody's life, and that's what we're failing to do. That wasn't a question, sorry.
So any other questions for Erin or Tina?
What do you think of that?
Yes.
Yes, I think there's a lady with her hand up in the middle of the room.
Hi, I am actually coming at this from a slightly different perspective. I am not a Californian. I work at Northwest Natural, which is an Oregon gas utility. But curious if you might have some thoughts that I could take back home with me as we are also trying to figure this out. Do you think that the biggest barrier in getting a gas standard adopted is possibly that a lot of legislators and a lot of the public is looking at an all electrification option? Is that a big barrier?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've got stakeholders here in California that want to go all electric as soon as possible, and if we spend a dime doing anything other than electric, then we're slowing that progress. And it's a significant debate in the legislature now, because we're also looking at cleaner, more efficient natural gas opportunities, and especially if you're looking at big heavy-duty trucks in some of the California communities that are really impacted by that pollution. you know, the question is, should we use state funds? Should we use our greenhouse gas revenue to fund those natural gas projects that might be cleaner? And even efforts to put in those natural gas vehicles, renewable natural gas. There was a policy last year, and that bill ran into significant obstacles from some of those environmental community stakeholders that didn't want to see funding go to natural gas, even renewable natural gas. They wanted to focus all on electrification, with the notion that even if that technology isn't ripe for some of those larger vehicles now, we don't want to slow it down by cleaning up the natural gas vehicles. Super controversial in California right now. And we don't have, that question hasn't been answered.
Any other questions? All right, well, I think you're looking at the two people in Sacramento who have done more or tried to do more for this industry than probably anyone else in the Capitol. So I really want to thank Erin and Tina very, very much for joining us.